Hello everyone, this is recording number 6 for Early Stoic Philosophy, a class on Stoic logic, physics, and ethics. And today I want to talk about propositions, or the Stoic conception of propositions, and in particular the Stoic claim that propositions are true or false. Now, the fact that the Stoics come up with a propositional logic, and that means a logic that is quite similar to modern logic, has been discovered only in the 1970s and 80s, and it created a lot of excitement. Until then, it was more or less assumed that ancient logic is like Aristotelian logic, and even though, some specialists knew a bit about Stoic logic, it was not widely appreciated that it is a quite stunning fact that the Stoics came up with an entirely different kind of logic from Aristotelian logic, one that is quite similar to our logic, to the extent that even though, of course, they do not use the word proposition, it is almost adequate to speak of propositions. The Greek term that I am translating here or rendering as proposition is axioma, and literally that means assertible. In our translations of the fragments, you will also find the word assertion, and that's okay in most contexts. But literally translated, an axioma, that is the Greek term, is an assertible, and that means it is something that can be asserted but need not be asserted. For example, Socrates is walking is an assertible that can be asserted but need not be asserted. Now, an assertible, an axioma, or in our terms, a proposition, is for the Stoics a kind of Lekton. And that term and the theory that is behind it is among the things that created the sort of really intense interest in the Stoics in the 1980s and 90s. What is a Lekton? Again, literally translated, a Lekton is a sayable, where that means it is something that can be said but need not be said. If you were to say walking, that would be what the Stoics call a deficient or incomplete sayable, Lekton. Why deficient or incomplete? Because if you say walking, someone might reply, who is walking? And then you would have to give a reply and make the sayable complete, as it were, by then saying, let's say, Socrates is walking. So Socrates is walking is an example for a complete Lekton. Walking, predicate walking, is an example for an incomplete or deficient Lekton. Propositions, Axiomata, that is the plural of axioma, are not the only kind of complete Lekton. There are also, for example, questions, exclamations, imperatives, which are complete sayables, complete Lekta. Lekta is the plural of Lekton. But, and now comes an important difference, they are not accessible as true or false. And axiomata, propositions, are in fact defined as what is true or false. That is in fragment 34a in the numbering of the Long and Sedley edition that we are using. So propositions are defined as that which is true or false. That is not the only definition of the axioma, but it is a very important one, which I want to explore here. And we could ask ourselves, what does that mean? It could be a fairly harmless claim, or it could be a philosophically weighty claim, and I want to suggest the latter. But here's first the way in which it could be a fairly straightforward and simple claim. If you look at the list of complete sayables, so the ones that I have mentioned were proposition, exclamation, question, imperative, then it might seem quite straightforward that among these complete sayables, only propositions are the kind of thing that is either true or false. Because let's say a question just isn't the kind of thing that is either true or false, or an exclamation just isn't the kind of thing that is either true or false. Now, that seems fairly unproblematic. But the Stoics not only say that propositions or axiomata are true or false, and they are the kind of thing that are true or false, they formulate this in quite precise terms that every axioma, every proposition either is true or is false. There is no axioma that is neither true nor false, and there is no axioma that is both true and false. And instead, every axioma, every proposition has one of these truth values. It is true or it is false. And that is sometimes described by saying that they are governed. Propositions are governed by the so-called principle of bivalency. Bivalency just means two values. So there are these two values, truth values, true and false. And every proposition is true or false. So what we could think about when we try to understand this is, what about impressions? In the past, when we talked about, let's say, cataleptic impressions, we were talking about true and false impressions. And if it were the case that propositions are really the only thing that is true or false, because they are defined as that which is true or false, then it would seem that the way we've been talking about impressions as true or false must be somehow a kind of lesser way. It must be somehow compatible with axiomata being the kind of thing that is true or false, but not impressions. And that seems complicated, and I want to invite you to think a little more about it. When we were discussing convincingness last week, if you continue to read the text where impressions are described as convincing or unconvincing or both or neither, the next bit in that text is that impressions are true or false or both or neither. And the first thing that should strike you as interesting here is that impressions are not governed by the principle of bivalency, because there are impressions that are both true and false, and impressions that are neither true nor false. And that I would sort of like to raise a question about that. Recall, impressions, human impressions, are rational impressions, they are our thoughts. So the claim is that we think thoughts that are both true and false, and thoughts that are neither true nor false. And that seems to be a quite tricky proposal, because those cannot be the thoughts, let's say, that correspond to questions, because a question isn't assessed in terms of truth and falsity to begin with. So they need to be somehow in the neighborhood of things that are truth accessible. And yet they are true and false, or neither true nor false. And I would like to invite you to look at the examples in the text and just try to make sense of what kinds of thoughts are the Stoics talking about here. And the second question I want to raise as a conclusion of this recording, a very contested question in the scholarship, is what is the relation between thought and propositions? So the picture is that rational thoughts have correlates that are Lekta, Sayables. And again, that can be an incomplete sayable, that can be a complete sayable. But the question is how that relation works. Is it the case that a true impression, let's say, is somehow more basic and prior to then the true Lekton that correlates with it? Or is it the other way around, that the true proposition that correlates with a true impression is somehow prior to the thought? And the way in which true and false impressions are being introduced in the text, namely that an impression is true if a true axioma, a true proposition can be formed of it. That is how it is being defined. That may be compatible with both of these readings, that either the axioma is the truth of the axioma and the axioma is prior, or the thought is prior. And I want to leave you with the question of how we should think about this.